We pushed it out. There was a DOE advisory committee that looked at it and recommended a large initiative. That was in kind of the fall of 19, right? But then, and we were starting to plan a series of deep dives that would have bound the program offices, and then the pandemic hit, and everything more or less stopped. Nevertheless, there was momentum, right? And the NSF and DOE did create programs and launched things, but we think there's more to be done. So this past spring, last year, 22, the same crew, plus now joined by our folks at the National Security Labs, decided to kind of reprise this whole process. And a lot has changed in the 3 years since the first set of town halls. So what changed? Well, first of all, large language models were, yeah, we knew about them, but they were not really penetrating consciousness. They've blown up in the last 3 years, obviously. Stable diffusion took off, captured people's imagination. AI was used to fold 1 billion proteins, right? Amazing. We're using it every day, actually, in cancer work here at the university. AI gave hints to some mathematicians, allowed them to prove some interesting theorems. There's been massive adoption of AI by people programming. This idea of AI as a pair programmer has actually come into the fore. In industry right now, the claim is that 40% of the code that productive programmers are generating is actually coming from completion, all completions or from AI, which is kind of an amazing number. AI is being used to accelerate high-performance computing applications through surrogates, and we'll talk more about that. And of course, exascale machines arrive. So this has been an incredible 3 years or so of progress. And we reorganized the community and held 3 workshops in the summer. We held them at HBCUs. It reflects the kind of new administration, and made some progress. So, but what was really clear is that there's been an increase in the capability gap between what the private sector can do, even relatively, small startups like OpenAI, and what the academic sector, public sector can actually do. And one of the things that we're focusing on is how do we close that gap, or at least make some headway on that. So one of the things that we did for the push this past summer is we said, well, look, let's challenge the community to think a bit harder about how they can leverage the assets that the public sector has, like exascale computers and exascale data infrastructure, the labs, and large-scale experimental facilities, huge amounts of scientific simulation capability, and big interdisciplinary teams. This is what industry doesn't have, right? Industry doesn't have these things. They maybe have 1,000 people working AI, but they don't have 50 years experience, say, in doing climate modeling or something like that. So we asked them to do that. And we also said, we got to organize our thinking a little bit differently. Last time we had tried to organize it almost in silos around disciplines. And this was interesting. We got to learn, for example, that the high-energy physicists can think big, and the biologists were a little bit challenged to think big. So we decided to turn and pivot things a bit this time around. And we have been noticing that if you look in the literature, and there's, obviously some exponential number of AI papers being published, and some fraction of that has to do with science, we started seeing patterns. We started seeing that, there's more areas, but we chose these kind of 6 emerging kind of AI capabilities that seem to impinge upon more than one discipline. So for example, surrogate models, this idea of using AI to accelerate simulations of various types is not unique to some particular domain. It's an idea that's finding broad application. The idea of foundation models, or some might just think of those as language models, but because it's a broader idea, are affecting many, many downstream applications. But the idea of, say, inverse design is compelling for materials or proteins or compounds in chemistry and so on. So we chose these 6 areas as kind of a basis set that orthogonalizes pretty well across the scientific domains. Now, it doesn't include everything. There's some things that are not in here, but we try to organize our thinking around these 6 topics. And in fact, we tuned them up a little bit. to have these 6 themes. And we challenged the community to think about in each domain, whether it's physics, biology, chemistry, material science, medicine, and so on, that we're at these meetings, to think about the opportunities in each of these bins, in each of these buckets. And what I'm going to tell you about in my whirlwind bootstrap of this meeting is a little bit about how we're thinking about this. It's not comprehensive, and in fact, I don't have enough time to make it comprehensive, and the report is imminent. It'll be out, it's in his last, he spent 90% of the time writing the report and 90% of the time getting the powers that be to approve the report, so we're in that last 90%. But I'm going to walk through this, and I'm going to do it in a particular order, no particular order, other than I'm saving the big one for the end. So let's just jump into it here. Let's talk about AI for high performance computing surrogates. So the basic idea here is, I'll go to this slide. The core idea, I'll come back a second, is to replace some expensive physical model in your simulation or set of models in your simulation with some machine learned approximate kernel. Now, there's a reason that you might want to do this. One reason might be that the AI replacement could be orders of magnitude faster. That's a common motivation. Another reason is that maybe your physical model is not everything you want it to be, and you have data, and you want to learn some kind of composite function that augments the physics. But this concept has been around for a while and extends traditional surrogates, low order, reduced order models that the community has been using, applied mathematicians have been using for a long time. But extends it with the idea that we're going to use machine learning to build these functions, and it builds on the idea that ML functions can be universal approximators, although we don't really use that in a serious way. And these have been developed in many, many areas: chemistry, materials, drug binding predictions, which we worked on, biophysical models, CFD, climate, and so on, right? And we get a lot of performance improvements. So this is typically how it's used. You've got some workflow. In this case here, say you're screening a whole bunch of materials, and you would normally use some kind of electronic structure calculations. That maybe it's density functional theory or some other high-level theory. And you would want to apply this to thousands or hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of configurations, and it's just too slow. So you build a surrogate model. You do maybe 10,000 or 100,000, say, calculations. You use that data to train a model, and now you have this fast approximate model that you use for screening. You predict some properties of the things that pass through that screen, and if you have interesting candidates, you might go back and run the actual physics model. This is almost exactly how we handle surrogates in the context of drug design. And what we can get with this surrogate model, there's a laser here. I don't want to turn this off. With a surrogate model, at least in controlled experiments, we can get up to a 20 million acceleration, 20 million X, with no real material loss in the accuracy of our simulations. So that's been kind of amazing. And this is happening everywhere, right? People are trying this idea in chemistry, in particle physics, building surrogates for detector simulations, things that burn up huge amounts of time on supercomputers, and so on, orbital mechanics, et cetera, right? In climate and weather, this is an interesting example. I just picked a paper I think it's somewhat interesting. This is one on building surrogate models for precipitation that you could drop into a climate model. And actually modeling precipitation is pretty hard. In this particular paper, they tried 3 different configurations. And as you might expect, there's the actual physics model, and then an 18-layer residual network, and they compute the differences and the error. And they get an interesting result. Is it ready to use off the shelf? Probably not. But is it interesting? Yes. And it's much, much faster. Right? Here's another example. This is in molecular dynamics. This is kind of the science plots here showing the air essentially and the density in their states, and showing the MD simulation, the ML prediction. It tracks these plots pretty well. And what's interesting about this one is I got a 10,000x speed up. So 10,000x, it's hard to put that in perspective, but we know in science, we spent billions of dollars trying to go from petascale to exascale, factor of 1,000. If I have an exascale machine and I have a numerical method like this that gives me a 10,000x speed up, I effectively have a zeta scale machine, right? We try not to say that very loud because we actually want a zeta scale initiative, right? Of course, that would give us a yotta scale machine, right? So we can keep imagining how we're going to use this. But you could even go beyond that. Here's some picture of some students and some researchers in our rapid prototyping lab during the pandemic, kind of making headway on here. But here's the kind of idea, right? The idea is that you're going to bring the same technology, automation, AI, edge computing that you might imagine in a modern factory. Imagine you're building a Tesla, okay, which is mostly done by robots. But now you're bringing this to the chemistry lab or the polymer lab or the material science lab. And you're going to have a series of stages, and you're going to try to bring AI and computing, maybe logical reasoning, to each of these stages, and to make a complete system that closes the loop. And then we want to scale it up. So this is, imagine a factory floor, and these robots here, these like tugboat robots can move modules around and reconfigure the factory floor based on the workflows and the science problems that people want to do in that week or that day or whatever. And this is gaining some traction. There's an international consortium called the Acceleration Consortium that's thinking about this. We've got collaborations with folks at CMU and Toronto and others that are doing this. And NSF and DOE are talking about collaborating to experiment with this. It'll be a big workshop in the next couple of months on this topic. And just to give you a flavor of some of the building blocks, I sampled a handful of the hundreds of papers. Now, Ian Foster and I teach a course. We're actually teaching it this quarter. We've done it now for the last 3 years on this idea here at the university. A lot of fun graduate students hacking robots, but let me give you an idea of some of the concepts. So in chemistry, a few years ago, there's been demonstrations here. This is from the group up in Toronto that built a little, they call it ChemOS. It's based on Bayesian optimization, and they can automatically run through and optimize thin film deposition on plates for some particular property. In this case, it's some electrical conductance. This thing, they have some times here, 13 minutes, 7 minutes. The AI runs for just a second or so. And they managed to get this to work. There's groups thinking about how you might use microfluidics to miniaturize and depress the cost of the experimental part of this, but still have a powerful AI, maybe a generative AI on top of it, and applying this to, say, drug design. And this is an example that's got a lot of interest, and they were able to get things out of this using what they call a 17 one-step reactions to synthesize wide ranges of compounds. And of course, compound synthesis is a huge bottleneck in drug discovery, as well as the idea that you could use the AI to tune the compounds to specific targets. But if you're building the infrastructure, one of the challenges is you want to have an AI help you with writing the instructions for the robots, write the protocols, right? Biology papers are filled with protocols. When you train a graduate student in a lab, a big part of their training is learning protocols. We would like the robots to be programmed by the AI so that the whole system responds to a high-level statement, can generate the protocols, generate the programming. And so there's some headway on this. And language models appear to be poised to be able to go, if they're trained on the right content, maybe in a retrieval augmented generative kind of way, to take an English prompt and produce not only an English description of the protocol, but a machine readable description of the protocol, and then compile that to the robot operating system. I believe that in the next 2 years, we'll see that as an end-to-end system. Now, even DALL-E is trying to help us build this. We ask it to imagine what the robot factories would look like to do science, and I can pick whichever you want. This one down here is a little scary. It's like the tables are like operating tables. We don't like that one. We kind of like some of the other ones. All right, what's another topic that we think is at the heart of doing science? It's using AI to write code and to do software engineering. And the reason that this is at the heart of science, you'll see in a second, is that most modern science is actually highly dependent on code. And there's been a huge amount of progress because the broad community, of course, is bottlenecked on coding, whether it's generating web pages or other kinds of code. But the question is, can we adapt this for the kinds of coding and so on that we need to do in science? So the scientific community runs on code. Code's often the bottleneck, and if we manage to get these software-defined labs up, writing code will even be more of a bottleneck, right? It's going to be the way you do science is by writing code. And of course, you want to have some appropriate abstraction level for writing that, improves your productivity. So what are some of the ideas here? Well, it's hard to give a talk on AI these days without quoting GPT or something. I tried to make it an interesting set of quotes a little bit. So first one on the left here is, I asked GPT-4, what languages do you feel comfortable generating programming code for? And I always talk to GPT like it's a person. I try to be polite to it. And it says, well, I'm a language model, but I can generate code for a lot of languages. And some of the languages I feel comfortable generating code for, boom, and this giant list actually goes to like 20 things. And I've used it to generate code in Python, C++, and a few others. And it's not bad. It sometimes makes mistakes, but it's cool programming with an assistant like this. But then I said, well, okay, this is classical computing. Can you write quantum programs? He said, if so, what quantum libraries are you familiar with? And it says, yes, I can help you write quantum programs. My knowledge is based on information up to September 21. And I'm familiar with several quantum libraries, and then boom, Qiskit from IBM, CERT from Google, Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane from Xanadu, and so on. And if you've ever used these things, there's a learning curve on using the interface. I actually did, I don't show you the results, but a couple weeks ago I was in Japan, and it's sleepless in Tokyo kind of thing. And so I'm sitting there asking GPT to generate, 2-electron simulation in Qiskit, and it could do it and I could run it, right? So entry-level stuff, it's not gonna, it actually kind of wrote a Shor's algorithm when I asked it to. It wasn't completely right, but it's amazing that you can even get anywhere with this, right? So this is kind of interesting. There's been a number of projects to build AI tools that can help you debug. So this is one called DeepFix that takes a code that fails in a compile, and then you say, help me, and it says, oh, you screwed up the index here. So this is kind of interesting. This is one example out of many that are in the paper. So because code's relatively easy to generate, that is, I can use an existing language model and write a high-level description, it'll generate code. I can then ask it to make 100 versions of that code. I can compile it. I can ask it to write a check program to see if it meets the spec. I can compile that, so I can have the code that the system wrote test the code that it wrote, right? And I can use all the successful examples as new training data, and this has been done. And this has been done last year. They wrote some training data, 155 puzzles, generated these synthetic puzzles, write code. They then verified and unverified. If they used the verified code, it improved the result from 7.5% of solving the puzzles to 38%. Just kind of a proof of principle that using an AI to generate bootstrap code to make itself better is feasible. I think this is pretty interesting, right? Okay, let's move on to control of complex systems. This one is pretty different.
Просто, да.
We build huge things. Humans build
Просто
fusion
распишись.
reactors, we build spacecraft,
Нормально,
we build
не так
accelerators.
стараемся.
The most complex machine on the planet is the internet. Second most complex machine on the planet is probably the power grid. It has millions of interconnected parts. And the question is, can we use AI to basically control and manage these systems?
Okay, thank
Better than
you.
what we can do today.
С этой двери.
The
С этой двери.
slice of a fusion reactor
можешь
in Switzerland that OpenAI did. So you remember this paper came out like last year, actually I think February 22. And since then they used this, they didn't give it a name, so it was called unnamed AI. has been used around 100 times on the tokamak at the Swiss Plasma Center, known as the Variable Configuration Tokamak, to control it. And when they control it, they move the plasma around, do the test shots. It can only run for about 2 seconds before it overheats. And so they only have these little windows, but they've been able to control it. And this was like the first proof of principle dynamic control of the plasma with an AI. Not to be unbeat, Carnegie Mellon partnered with Princeton Plasma Lab and the guys in San Diego at D3D. And this is Ian Char, who's a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon, who got to run the fusion reactor there using his AI code and controlling the reactor. There's some blurbs on this. And this was in September of this past year. Now it's his PhD work and he hasn't published his thesis yet, so I can't tell you much more about it, but it worked. Didn't blow up. Of course, fusion reactors really don't blow up, they just putter out. But this shows that this idea has some legs. Right now, there's lots of other things you can imagine controlling this way, that we have complex controls, but they're not very effective. For example, accelerator controls, we're limited to running them in very stable configurations because they're so hard to control. Detectors in light sources or energy physics, same thing. We have very locked down control systems on these things. We can't tune them, adapt them to the configurations. Chemical reactors, power grids, manufacturing systems. So there's a collection of problems where AI can really extend the control regime, and I think these are worth exploring, and they're quite different than other applications. Now, one that's a lot of people think about is this idea of AI for properties prediction, and then as soon as you do that, the thing immediately pops into your head is you want to use it for inverse design. So what's the notion here? So if I have some system and I have a lot of data, I can build a model relatively easily. This is almost essentially automatable now. It is automatable for many problems, where I have some features and I predict some properties, and I can predict one property or a vector of properties. This is pretty routine. I'll give you an example. It's a little bit not routine in a minute, but this is applied to thousands of problems. But once we have that, if we can build some model that can capture the distribution, and we can then sample from that distribution, we can use it in a generative fashion. We can generate examples, new examples, right? So first, let me show you a pretty interesting idea. This is from a group that is building an interpretable model to go from genomes to phenotype, from genotype to phenotype. And this is being applied to humans. So there's just a paper, it's called GenNet. It's fairly recent. And what are they doing that's different? So they decided, instead of having generic layers in their network, they decided that all the layers had to be fully interpretable in terms of known biological concepts. So they provide in the toolkit a set of predefined layers in terms of biological abstraction. So local biological pathways, and then global pathways, regulatory pathways, and so on. SNPs map to genes, map to local and global pathways. This is an example of all the processes that are captured in this system. So it's fully interpretable. Every layer, every variable actually has a meaning derived from biological literature, which is kind of bizarre, some level, but it works. They took data sets across many different applications, trying to predict things like hair color, eye color, bipolar disorder, atrial fibrillation, coronary artery disease, dementia, et cetera, male pattern balding. I'm sure that one's very important to lots of people, asthma, and so on. And here's some results. This is using only internal representations that are completely grounded in biology. This is kind of mind-blowing that it works. Now, the question is whether or not the patterns that networks that are not built this way learn are in fact learning this, and I think there's evidence that, in fact, that they generally do the same thing. So that's interesting. Now, once you have forward models, of course, you want to think about inverse design, and this is whether it's materials, chemical compounds, biomolecules, polymers, lots of groups are doing this. So the basic notion is, normally you have some kind of physical model that can go forward in the first column here. From some, say, chemical configuration to a property. But what you'd like to do is go from a distribution of properties, sample that part of the property space, and predict the actual object. And there's several different ways to do that. One way is to use something like a variational autoencoder to capture a latent space that you label with properties and you resample in there. That's been done by a lot of groups. Often the challenge is not that, but it's figuring out how to represent the actual objects that you're trying to model. And chemical compounds, because of things like SMILE strings, are relatively easy to represent. Protein sequences relatively straightforward to represent. But sometimes things like crystals, right, with space groups, complex numbers of atoms, or different species of atoms are actually quite challenging, but there's been some progress. So one that's I find really fascinating is this one called an invertible crystallographic representation for general inverse design of inorganic crystals with targeted properties. So what are they doing here? They're actually building a matrix where they have a combination of features, the elements, some kind of lattice connectivity, some site coordination matrix, occupancy, some elementary properties, and then a reciprocal space version of that. So they capture in many different ways each of these structures. They then do a variational autoencoder like approach and have a system where they can sample and produce systems that give them interesting results. So there's lots of progress to be done, lots of progress there, and progress yet to be done. So language models, of course, can help here. You can take anything you can represent as a string or that you can tokenize, you can run through a language model, get an embedding and use those embeddings as features. And this has been done in chemistry and in many other areas. It's being done in protein science, both from this paper and some work that our group has done in collaboration with Caltech, and he was here somewhere. Anyway, that shows that this can work. So that's lots of progress on inverse design, and it's still wide open, I would say, for many, many things, particularly complex structures and materials. So what about foundation models? This is kind of the last one. And this idea of foundation model, somewhat controversial. Stanford kind of organized a big part of their AI effort around this. And for many people, it's just kind of synonymous with language models, but I think that's a too simplistic view. But it does point out that these large models are really general purpose systems. But the basic concept here, right, is some large scale model that's been pre-trained on a whole lot of different types of data, maybe in some multimodal fashion. Maybe it's pre-trained, maybe you just think of it as training. And then there's various ways of adapting it to downstream tasks. That's the high level concept, right? And of course, we know that this is working because we're seeing incredible successes with models like GPT. The issue is how to extend this in ways that are meaningful to science, right? So what are some opportunities in science for foundation models? Well, one opportunity is that if you train this model on huge amounts of scientific literature, you can use the model to distill that knowledge into more computable objects. And we've been working on this in the context of protein interaction networks. I'll show you a picture of that in a second. But you can do it across other things, right? You can do it across material science, across chemistry, across medicine. So this idea of using the model as an integrator, as a synthesizer, and then pulling information out of it in a form that you can compute on using traditional structured information tools, I think is very powerful. Second thing is that it appears that these kinds of models can synthesize across domains in a way that humans can do to some degree. For example, when you're asking it to write a program for something, you're usually writing prompt in terms of some domain question, and the model is taking those domain objects and mapping that into a programming construct. The same way, well, I don't know if it's doing it the same way, but it's doing it in a fashion that mimics how a person might do it. Foundation models are getting better at generating plans and solving logic puzzles. There's been various improvements over the last 3 or 4 years in this, writing experimental protocols for robots and so on. So we think that this is an area that needs more pushing. And to Paul's comment earlier at the kickoff here, perhaps we can push these models. We have to understand better how they work and what the challenges are here towards this notion of being able to generate hypotheses that give us new testable theories. And I think this is really almost a holy grail kind of problem. Scale seems to matter, right? This is from the Brown paper, where they exclaimed, we see this emergent behavior. Of course, it kind of wasn't expected. This idea that scale makes a huge difference in the performance of these models. That might have been predicted from just basic understanding of neuroscience, but I think came as a somewhat of a surprise. And how to exploit this is not completely clear, but you can see it in an example. So I ask a billion parameter model how to make beer. It makes up a nonsense recipe about making it in the oven, and it's kind of crazy. But if I ask a 175 billion parameter model about how to make beer, it's actually not bad. It's a plausible high level notion. I tried it with GPT-4. Training big language models is a huge computing task, right? We're right now scoping out a trillion parameter model. We want to train out Aurora as it comes up, the exascale machine at Argonne that we're calling Aurora GPT. Big scientific effort. We're going to wrap around that. It's probably going to take about a month of an exascale system to train, and exascale systems right now cost, you just net out the dollars, about $500,000 a day. So this is about a $15 million experiment. But as a consequence, most academic groups are left behind. This was just the training, the data just confirms, this is Palm's training that was about an exaflop for a month. This is like the plots, you've all seen that. This is kind of exaflop days at the top here. So we're pushing in these exaflop days, think in terms of millions of dollars. But as a consequence, this is happening, right? The academic community is more or less being shut out of large scale AI results, except through, collaborations. And of course, there is another challenge, which is you build these big models and you're trying to assess how well they work. It's a huge effort. So this is a pretty amazing paper, simply by the scale of the authorship. Here's science paper, 400 authors, 130 institutions. This is the big paper, Beyond Imitation Game, where they try to organize a vast community effort to evaluate language models using the standardized interface. So we're going to need more of this, not less of this. You're going to have to evaluate these systems the same way you kind of evaluate smart people. But they may provide some way of, as I mentioned, this knowledge integration distillation. So knowledge distillation is this idea that you've got this pre-trained model and you're going to systematize a set of prompts and extract and then validate what's coming out of it to build a structured object. And we've done this with GPTs to distill protein interaction networks. And the idea here is ultimately we want to replace biological data curation with a system like this. So crafting the current understanding of protein interaction networks has taken thousands of people hours to curate these things. This was done in about 15 minutes with the checkpoint protein that's in one of the cancer progression pathways. And the layout is, of course, coming automatically from GraphViz. The colored lines have to do with how I'm validating the connections, but all these connections are validated. The green ones are super validated, that is, multiple external sources agree. The black ones are consistent with multiple sources. The blue ones consistent with one source, and orange consistent with only one different source, right? Giving you some sense that some linkages are more confident than others. Of course, the networks can generate huge amounts of data. Then you now have a bottleneck problem of how you validate it. But here's something that in the process of doing that, you kind of have fun. So let me just show another example. So I asked the model, what's the set of genes that are more differentially expressed, say if you expose a tissue to radiation, like you might have, say, in space travel. And it gives me these 25 genes. And then I say, well, based on these responses, can you generate a GraphViz dot file showing the interactions? I have to keep prompting it, please continue, because it gets bored. I have to keep asking it to continue. It finally gets done with it, and then it draws it, and I ask it to give me the nature of the interactions on the edges, right? Now, of course, I have an object that this is not validated yet, but it's in a language that I can understand, right? I'm not staring at lists. I can stare at this. I have some understanding of these interactions. It's pretty impressive. This took about 10 minutes, right? Something that you might take a week or so to do by yourself if you're trying to pull it out of the literature. So finally, I'm last slide here. I didn't coordinate with Paul, but we did ask GPT-4 and Bard the same question. And this one's a little bit strange. So I was having an email exchange with some friends about some work that we're doing, where I was being somewhat hyperbolic, and I say something like, here we're trying to understand a phenomenon that's intrinsically stochastic and insanely complex. So all the ideas are about how to manage that while still getting some information gain out of the workflow. Loosely, you're trying to maximize the information you learn while minimizing the cost or complexity of the experiments, like avoid using animals. It's not a well-defined system, so the ideas largely have to do with reusing what we already know works, and repurposing it rather than trying to debug new technology, right? So I said, well, I wonder what I can make out of that. I mean, this is me babbling. So I ask it, I'm going to give you a description of something. I want you to tell me what the thing is. So I give it the description. I say, now, please tell me what field of science we're talking about. And it comes back and says, based on the description, it seems like we are talking about the field of computational biology or bioinformatics. And I'm saying, well, that's pretty reasonable, right? Somebody who's spying on my mail would probably come to the same conclusion. I asked Bard's not quite as good. I'm not really trashing Bard. It's still pretty good. It says it's computational science. Okay, and tries to give me a Wikipedia entry about what computational science is. So it's not quite there yet. So anyway, that's my high-speed tour. These are just things to think about during this week. I wasn't trying to be comprehensive. I am trying to give you some clues, though, about how we're trying to organize the national initiative. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why we want to couple AI and science. Partly it's to accelerate science. Partly it's to go back to really understanding more deeply how we do science and how we can teach machines to help us do science. So there's a kind of a deep motivation on that. There's also, of course, a lot of people that are concerned about this, about putting people out of work or somehow making systems even more elite oriented than they are. And one of the things that we've been doing, and I know this is true in Mike's classes and others, that whenever one's talking about AI and teaching is to include some component on ethics or responsibility in doing this. And this comes up often in these kinds of applications. So for example, on the self-driving lab piece, we were asked the other day, how would we prevent it from being used to build a chemical weapon, for example, which is a common, I think people worry about. And I would say that we're not very far along on that, trying to infer the intent. And one of the reasons why I asked the GPT-4 to interpret that little paragraph was to try to understand how would we get at intent? Could we look at somebody's experimental protocol and infer, for example, what they're trying to do at a higher level? So with that, let me stop and see if there's any time for questions, but I got a couple minutes for questions. Thank you.
Maybe I could actually
Sure.
start into I wonder if you could kind of help me visualize how the human will interact with the system in the future. Like if I think forward 10, 20 years, what will the day of a scientist look like?
So I mean, the real answer, I have no idea, but I can tell you what I've been doing, which is so I tend to write code every day. Sometimes it's during breakfast on Sunday morning. And I'm now coding with ChatGPT sitting there as an assistant. And so no longer am I searching, on the web to find some arcane API or some piece of Python I can't remember. I'm in a little dialogue with the AI, and I found it's fun. It feels like you can code again, because you're not like, your brain isn't mush. And it allows you to focus on the thing you're trying to do rather than the actual syntax or the details of the implementation of what you're trying to do. So I can imagine that the future is going to be more like that, that the intent, the drive, the problem I'm trying to solve, the kind of mental search that I'm doing for some new concept or for some new experiment is still going to be driven by me, but the system is going to be helping me a lot more, right? And I think that's quite exciting. And it's not just me. I mean, much of my colleagues are doing the same thing. You know, this notion of AI pair programming, and it makes programming fun again because you don't have the same learning curve, right? You can try things without having to spend a ton of time trying to learn an interface. And so I think the future could look more like that. There's probably dark versions of that as well, but I'm a, you know, glass is overflowing kind of person. So I think that the future is going to be a blast. I think these AIs are going to make everybody's life a lot more fun. And it's going to raise the nature of what we have to deal with in building things for the future.
Yeah, I guess that's on sort of the programming side of things. What about on the interpreting side of things?
So I mean, I didn't talk about my own work here very much, but you know, we're using AI to try to understand things about cancer, and we're often using models we're trying to mine the model, assess what the model is doing to try to get some insight as to interactions or features in the biological system that we don't know about, or that maybe we have some notion, but we're not sure if our notion is correct. And we're trying to look for evidence that we might be on the right path. I think there's an example that, you know, DeepMind did this collaboration with some mathematicians a year or so ago, where they used AI to generate ideas. They weren't trying to solve the direct problem. They were using it to analyze a kind of an experimental mathematics kind of way to get ideas, and then use the traditional, say, proof techniques to actually work on that. I think we're going to see more of that too, using it as an idea generator.
Max.
Yeah, thank you for a wonderful talk. Really enjoyed it. I have a question about, so you've given examples where sort of it was a very general model like ChatGPT asking questions about biology. There were also examples in your talk where really the inductive biases were built into the model, like the genotype, the phenotype one. So in your view, in the future, are we going to see this very general architecture, or is it more like some intelligence that's trying to call sort of very dedicated specialist programs that are very precise, so that they can compute things without mistakes?
Yeah, this is a really important question. We're debating it a lot. So the question is the future, and I threw out, I mean, it's already a huge deck. I threw out lots of slides to try to frame this. There's two alternate versions of the future, right? One version of the future is that every data set has dozens of models, right? So we see this in like drug response, where a handful of data sets, 100 models published in the last 3 years on the same data sets. And we're like, how can we learn anything from that? So we have a program trying to build tools to ingest all those models and figure out what they're doing. So one version of the future is that a plethora of models, they're super specialized. They outnumber humans by factors of 1,000 or 1,000,000 or something, and it's a mess, right? That's one, I think it would be a mess. The other vision of the future is more like evidence for things like GPT, which is that we just have a handful of these super powerful models that are super general, and we just keep making them more powerful. And as you've been following the GPT saga, they've recently started expanding this thing with what they call plug-in architecture. So they can plug Mathematica into it, they can plug different things into it. And that feels very compelling, right? Because now I have a system that just keeps getting better and better and better. I can throw all the scientific knowledge in it at some level. And it's a super generalist, right? And of course, we can debate about whether it's stepping stones to AGI or something, but that's a super compelling model, particularly in that I don't have to train it. Of course, I've got a project to try to train one, but you know, the general community can use that without having to actually build it, right? So there's a whole, it opens up a different use case. So I think both of these things will happen. But my bias is towards this small number of super powerful generalizable models. I think that's the economically consistent way it will go. I think, of course, people will do their own individual thing all the time, but it will be increasingly difficult to compete with these very large systems. And that's one of the reasons why we need, in the academic community, in the public sector, right, alternatives to the handful of models being built by industry, not because industry is evil necessarily, but because we need to have an ability to train students and workforce on how to build these things in a way that's open, as opposed to just being users. And the thing that was very disheartening was when the GPT-4 paper came out a couple of weeks ago, there was absolutely no information about its architecture, about its training. So it's become a black box. I mean, in the darkest sense of that word. And that is probably not good for the field. Maybe it's good for OpenAI and Microsoft as a revenue generator, but so I think we have this balance, but if I had to bet, I'd say the big models are going to win.
So do you think the accelerating cost of training is going to be a barrier
It's not an
to
issue.
further advancement?
No. $15 million to get a model that creates $1 billion in revenue, no problem. Think about fintech. Fintech will waste that much just waking up in the morning.
But if we look ahead, is there a barrier?
I don't see it. You know, at the point we got 10% of GDP going into training models, okay, we can talk about it. But right now it's in the noise. You know, every time SpaceX, you know, screws up, it's 10 language models worth of money, right? So I think people who are worried about CO2 for model training or dollars, I think they're on the wrong track. They're not putting in the right perspective of how much other things cost versus the benefits. So I'm not worried about that personally.
Maybe I can ask Dr. Smith come up here, and then we can take one more quick question. And then ask the question.
So I see how language is relevant for some scientific tasks that you can express as strings, like some biology tests. But it seems like all the scientific problems I'm working on to apply AI is fundamentally numbers. And so like predicting the climate, blood flow, the sort of thing. And it's hard to see how that maps to a language model and how it would help to combine these fields. So like, I'm not going to improve my climate prediction by adding particle physics data. It's
Maybe. So you asked two different questions, and I think language models are really sequence learners, and anything that can be tokenized, they can compute on, and you can tokenize images, you can tokenize 3D volume fields, you can tokenize pretty much anything. So of course, some types of data are huge when you do that, right? Take a climate model and try to voxelize the whole thing and tokenize it, would be this massive thing. So that might not be the most efficient way to do it, but I think we probably should stop thinking of language models as language models and think of them as just sequence learners, autoregressive sequence learners. In terms of cross-disciplinary learning, this is, I mean, again, slides I threw out of the deck, but you know, there's a lot of work on multitask learning and how models can generalize across tasks. And I'm pretty convinced that, with very little evidence, so it's debatable, that that models that are really used in science will start to show this kind of emergent multitask learning across representations in different domains. They may just rediscover mathematics, which of course is how we think about that more generally, right? So I'm pretty optimistic, but I think that's going to be a long road to make headway on that. And plus, I think, you know, transformers are just kind of this moment in time. I think we have a benchmark of how good they are, but something new is going to be invented that I think will do better than that. And if we can learn about multimodal learning, then, you know, one thing might be that we can imagine models that have vastly more flexible input structures. I don't think there's any rule against that. So I would still be on the side of, we'll probably find ways of connecting these things. Let me stop there.
Great.